Hello there, this is David Legan from the NOD Training Group. Today we'll be wrapping up our quarterly Ag Survey Program, or CROPS APS. This is the last quarter. This is December of 2021. So last CROPS APS of the year. We are collecting final acreage and yield information for row crops and hay and forage crops, as well as picking up information on grain stocks, grain and storage. This information levels the playing field for farmers and ranchers, giving them access to the same information that is available to elevators, input suppliers, bankers, and others with whom they do business. It also provides global markets with information on the United States as a supplier of major commodities. Additionally, USDA agencies use the information to evaluate and administer vital farm credit, conservation, disaster, insurance, loan, and commodity programs. Universities, extension agents, private and government economists, the farm media, and others depend on the data to help them analyze what's on the horizon. Farm organizations use the information to form their policy positions as well. So as you can see, there are a lot of interested parties in this data that we are collecting. Project code is 127, December crop stock survey. Questionnaires go out around November 19th. Web reporting option is available. There are two different releases coming out on January 8th of next year, that is 2022. We have the Crop Production Annual Report and we have the Grain Stocks Report. The introduction should be very familiar to you. It's pretty much the same intro that we've been doing on all these crops APS surveys, as well as some of our other crop surveys. Verify that name and address, figure out if the operation has any of the items of interest. That would be things like crops, cropland, if they have stocks, if they have storage capacity. If they don't have any ag activity, that's when we might assume they are out of business. So complete those follow-up questions to determine the operation's status. And then in the case of a new operator, get as much information on that as possible, name, address, phone number, that sort of thing. Then figure out how the operation is structured, whether that is individual partners or hired manager. Moving on from there takes us to our acres operated section, which you should all have seen multiple times by now. So acres owned, rented from, rent to, get our total acres on the operation. Again, with that, make sure that they are accounting for all land, not just their cropland, as sometimes they do. Moving on from there, we pick up how much is actually cropland. With this, however, don't forget that hay counts as crop, so does CRP, summer fallow, and cropland pasture. It has been noticed that more records over the last few quarters have been leaving this blank. Be sure to ask this question and record it properly. Much like we are doing for our row crop cap survey, we also want to pick up the county where the largest value of ag was raised or produced. And if it's the same in different counties, choose the county with the most acres and write notes. If it's about the same value and acres in different counties, you can maybe figure out if the operator lives in one of those, and if so, you can choose that one, but also put that in a note. And then if yields, they tell you that yields were vastly different between the counties, you can write that in a note as well. There are a variety of different row crops in the survey. The ones asked will depend on what state you are interviewing in, however. We have the big ones, the more obvious stuff like corn and soybeans and cotton. But then you also get into things like rice and dry edible beans and sunflowers. You also have things like lentils and sugarcane, canola. So quite a variety of different row crops. And then we also have a few different types of tobacco as well. The first crop asked is basically going to be corn for most states. All the ones I looked at were corn. One of them out there might not be corn, but everything I saw, it starts with corn. However, there can be several questions about it. We want to know the acres that were planted for all purposes. So it could have been corn for grain, could have been corn for seed, could have been for silage, could have been abandoned, whatever it is. If it says planted, we want them to record it there. All the states that ask about corn will also ask corn acres harvested for grain and acres harvested for seed in separate questions. Previously, maybe a couple of years ago, we had that in the same question, but now they are separate. With this, we want to know the acres harvested and to be harvested, and then they can either give a total production number or they can give us the yield per acre. With New York and Pennsylvania, they might have some additional questions about high moisture shelled corn and ground high moisture ear corn. Not sure how prevalent that will be. However, those are the only states that ask that. We also ask about acres cut for silage, and again, they can give total production or yield per acre. Just note that that should almost always be reported in tons. So if you have somebody reporting tons in the grain or seed category question, then most likely they are mixing that up with their silage. Or if they are responding to the silage question with bushels, they might have just gotten off a question there as well. So be mindful of the units as you pick up these corn harvested questions. And then again, those acres for all other purposes, those would be things that weren't harvested, right? So that would have been things that were grazed off, it was abandoned, whatever it was. If it wasn't harvested for grain, seed, or silage, that is where it needs to show up because we need to account for all of those acres that were planted. A little bit more about corn. So, harvested for grain, we are looking for all corn harvested other than seed or silage. End use doesn't matter. This could have been livestock feed, could be going to corn syrup, could be going to ethanol, whatever it was. If it wasn't seed or silage and it was harvested, that would be corn for grain. Corn harvested for seed, however, typically that's going to yield much less than regular field corn. Feed companies usually pay the farmers based on an adjusted production or yield to compensate for this. Be mindful of this because the farmer might try to report the settlement account bushels instead of the actual total production or his payment yield instead of the actual yield. So just keep in mind that we want the actual yield or the actual production. So moving on from corn, again, most likely you'll start with that, and then you'll ask questions about different row crops, and which questions you ask will just depend on what state you're in. But the other row crops, they do kind of ask questions in the same basic format. We want to know what was planted for all purposes. Then we want to know what was harvested and to be harvested. Then they can give total production or yield per acre. And then we pick up those acres for all other purposes. In cases of extremely low yield, be sure to verify the harvested acres. It could be a situation where only a few acres were actually harvested to prove yields for insurance purposes. In a situation like that, you would only have a few harvested acres reported, and then the rest would fall under all other purposes. And then please leave notes anytime there are acres for all other purposes. You know, what happened to them, why were they not harvested, what ended up being done with them, what were they used for, just any sort of explanation because they really do look at that and wonder what happened. A few things to remember for you. Grain sorghum is often referred to as milo. Forage sorghum might be called cane, however, that is not to be confused with sugarcane. Cane hay is reported in both the sorghum planted section and the other hay harvested. If a producer says that they grow beans, be sure to specify that they mean soybeans because we also have dry edible beans on the survey as well, and we definitely don't want to mix those two up. On the subject of those dry edible beans, dry edible peas, and lentils, those can be challenging to get into the correct categories. So if an operator reports any of these, please verify with the operator. There are several classes of dry edible beans, and please leave a note as to what class that was. Here are some of the different classes. So if they try to tell you one of these, when you ask what kind of beans you're growing, if they say this, well, that is definitely not a soybean. So if possible, try to put down this variety, and that will make the statistician at the RFO's lives a lot easier. Moving on from those row crops, we also ask about hay and forage crops. Depending on the state, we're either asking for dry hay harvested only, or we might ask about dry hay and haylage as well. Again, it varies by state, but you might ask about alfalfa and alfalfa mixtures. It might also ask about small grain hay. It might ask about all other hay. And then it might also ask about alfalfa for seed. And just to refresh everybody's memory, dry hay is dried, has somewhere between like 16 to 18% moisture and then baled. Haylage and or baleage, that is hay for silage, is wet, more like 50 to 70% moisture, chopped and fermented. Since haylage is wetter, yields are typically a lot higher. For alfalfa, it might be 5 to 13 tons an acre compared to only 1.5 to 9 tons per acre for dry hay, given those are approximate numbers. These acres can be cut multiple times, so it could be the case that they harvested the same acres for dry hay and then turned around the next time they harvested it for haylage. We will be picking up acres cut for dry hay. We want the dry hay production or yield, the total for all dry hay cuttings. So we do want the total of all the cuttings. They can either report in tons, tons per acre, bales, bales per acre. So there's a lot of different ways they can report. Just note that if they do report in bales, then the bale weight is very important because hay bales can come in all different sizes. So without that weight, we can't really make sense of how much production they have. One thing new for 2021 here is that the bales per acre includes a decimal point now. So be sure to get that. So if they, back in the past, I think they could have only reported in whole bales per acre, but now we can easily pick up something like, 4.5 bales an acre, whatever it is. Just be mindful of that decimal point. As I mentioned, some states will ask about acres cut for haylage or green chop. With that, they can either give production or yield the same way that they gave in dry hay. In Montana, They have questions about alfalfa harvested for seed, and then acres and yield of clean seed. They also break that out by irrigated and non-irrigated, whereas I don't believe we ask irrigated and non-irrigated anywhere else on any of the other states' questions. And then they ask about usage of leafcutter bees for seed production. Some additional questions about hay. We ask about their hay stocks on December 1. We also ask about alfalfa seedings this year. And then we also ask about small grains planted for the 2022 crop year. This could have been for any purpose, and that would be things like, winter wheat, other spring wheat, barley, rye, just whatever it is. Be sure the operator understands that we are asking about planting or seedings this fall for the coming crop year, not for 2021. So moving on from our row crops and our hay, now we get to the part of the questionnaire that's picking up the data that we published for the grain stocks report, and this is all about storage capacity and crops stored. So when we ask about storage capacity on the total acres operated, this means on farm only. So we're excluding any sort of storage capacity in town or at the elevator. Just remember that it's on farm and they don't even necessarily have to own it. If it's stored on their farm, we want them to be the one to report it. We ask about whole grains or oilseeds stored on the operation, regardless of crop year produced, regardless of ownership, intended final use, or government program. Any stocks that are on the operation must be collected. If a respondent can't or won't give you the amount stored, try to determine at least what was stored. So in this case, you would record a don't know for the commodities on hand and then a 0 for all the others. This partial data is obviously better than nothing, so if you can, at least get that from them. Be sure to exclude any grain that is stored off the operation. So I think I've said it about 5 or 6 times now, but again, we only want what is on the operation there on the farm, nothing that is elsewhere. Just like the row crop questions we asked earlier will vary depending on what state you're in, so will the crops stored or asking about these stocks questions. So you might ask about corn, soybeans, wheat, oats, chickpeas, lentils, rice. So a variety of different things that we might be asking about their stocks on. And then we finish up with a few additional questions. We ask about any unharvested crops on December 1st. Again, these are crops for the current 2021 crop year that will be harvested, because remember, we did ask what was harvested and to be harvested. With this, we'd like to know the acres that are left to be harvested and the expected yield. And then I believe this only applies to corn, soybean, and sorghum, and it only is in select states. We also like to know if this production was included in the grain in storage. Any crops that are still unharvested should be included. There are a number of different things you need to watch out for as you go through this survey and go through these interviews. Large acreages on any specific item, actually. So anything like, large amount of rented land, total acres on the operation, cropland, or large acreages of a specific crop. Just make sure that we have the right number, that we aren't accidentally maybe including something else. Any change in the acreages, so changes into the total acres on the operation, change in the number of cropland acres or in specific crops. On a lot of these, we already have an idea of how much corn they have planted there in the operation, so if that's gone up a lot or gone down a lot, we need to make sense of that. Cases where there's a large amount of acres that are not for grain or seed, please leave notes explaining what that is. Anytime we have a crop survey, we're always concerned if we could get really high or really low yields reported. In the cases of really low yields, maybe there was some sort of problem, in which case you can ask the operator about that and maybe put in that they've, been suffering from drought conditions. In the case of really high yields, maybe they have all their crops irrigated and they've just had a great season. Whatever it is, there's usually something that you can put in a note to explain really high and low yields. Large number of acres for all other purposes. It kind of goes back to that same question or same thing we mentioned about a large amount that was not for grain or seed. Just remember that anytime you have those all other purposes, you need to leave a note explaining what happened to those crops. The acres planted math has to work out on that. So the acres harvested plus the acres for all other purposes must add back up to the acres planted. Be mindful of any potential double cropping situations. A change in grain storage capacity is also something you need to be mindful of, because grain bins don't just disappear or appear overnight. So then if their capacity has gone up or gone down, there should be some sort of justification that you can add on to that record. Large amounts of a specific crop stored. If you get this case, just one thing I would do for sure is confirm that they are only giving you what's on the acres operated and they aren't maybe erroneously including something that is not there on the farm. One thing to be aware of is the western United States is suffering from a pretty severe drought across quite a number of different states here. So this could impact things like the yield, it could impact things like the overall production, maybe the amount of harvested acres and the acres for all other purposes. We might see the impacts from this show up in several different questions. So if that's what's happening there when you're talking to somebody, please leave good notes about that. Here is the latest information from the crop production report. You can see that corn production is up slightly from the September forecast, soybean production is up 2%, cotton is down 3%, and you can read the rest of the numbers there, but as of October 1, yields for corn are expected at 176 bushels an acre, yields for soybeans are at 51.5, and then cotton is 871 pounds per harvested acre. So maybe that gives you an idea of some averages to expect. But again, with some of those droughts in some areas that maybe just irrigated all, you could see stuff way above those averages or way below. Just please make notes anytime you have things that are well below or above the averages. Here's the progress of corn harvesting. Seen here as of October 24th, we were at 66% harvested compared to 53% for the last 5 years. So corn is ahead of schedule. Soybeans also ahead of schedule, but not as much so, 73% compared to 70%. All right, we also have a bit of information here from the RFOs. Most of this stuff is stuff that can apply to all regions, not just the one that sent it to us. So all right, what happens if you have a bad phone number that you call and it's out of service? Well, if you make a comment about that, please list the actual phone number. Here's an example of two different types of comments about phone numbers that RFOs see from time to time. You have one that just says phone to NIS, NIS being not in service. That's not going to be helpful because on their end, the RFOs aren't able to see what's listed as phone number 1 or what's phone number 2. So that would not be very helpful to the RFO. However, if you say something like where you spell it out, phone number 12345678890 not in service, that's a good note because that lets them know which number is actually the one that you are having trouble with. If the operator is deceased, this is a complete report. It is not a refusal or inaccessible. Please try to find out who has taken over the operation and leave notes about that and their contact info. For hay, don't forget the new decimal point on hay bales per acre on all three types of hay. That trailing digit is important. Report the bale shape, size, and weight as well. So if you're picking up that weight of that bale, if you can also explain that it's a 4x5 round bale, that is helpful. Temporary storage. So a couple notes on storage capacity and crops in storage. In temporary storage, there might be some operators that are using these big temporary bags to store grain in the field. This is not included in storage capacity questions. So the first question in the storage section about how much capacity do they have on the farm, I believe that question is worded something to the effect of on all structures normally used to store grain, and these temporary situations are not what is normally used to store grain. So that amount of storage capacity in these big bags, that would not apply to their overall usual storage capacity, so they would exclude it from this question. However, it is included when we ask about crops on hand or what was stored in the operation. That would be question 2. So what is the farm's capacity? The temporary doesn't count. What they have in storage on the farm, if it's in these temporary situations, that does count into what they have on hand. Another thing here, kind of an odd situation, is that if the temporary storage methods are being used, the operator might report having more grain stored than they have storage capacity. So if they have it stored in a temporary setup where they have maybe 20,000 bushels stored, but they report only having 10,000 bushels of storage capacity, that actually is okay, but please make a note about what kind of temporary storage is being used. For grain stored and storage capacity, we are only wanting to know about the whole grains. For operations with livestock, it would be very helpful to confirm that the grain is actually whole and that is not rolled, cracked, sweetened, mixed with other grains, etc. Oftentimes, dairies will not store whole grains, only store processed grains for feed, and so those would be ones that we actually don't want because, again, we only want whole grains. If you run into reluctant respondents, somebody saying, well, what's in it for me? I don't even use the USDA data. How will this even help me? Just remind them that by reporting, you allow us to accurately reflect their area's planted, harvested, and production levels, which can then be used by a variety of different entities. For example, other USDA agencies use NASS data to help administer their programs, local extension agents use it for crop recommendations, and local ag businesses use it for ordering supplies. As we all know, if they try to say they give everything to the FSA office, we are actually asking different information than what the FSA collects. So we would have an incomplete picture if all we did was pick up their FSA data. When in doubt, comment it out. I think you've heard me say to write comments out about a million times so far in this presentation, but that is just because it is so important. This extra information that you include is key to the accuracy of our estimates. And again, comments for any time that you have acres for all other purposes. Be sure to work through a few practices on your iPad before interviewing. Again, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to a supervisor or your local RFO. And last but not least, thank you for not only the hard work on this December crops APS, but all the previous quarters of this APS program this year. So thank you very much, and that is all.